I'm your host, Joel Hastings at dairybusiness.com, and our guest today is from the Green Mountain state of Vermont. And while it's not a big milk-producing state in the grand scheme of things, dairying is very important in this largely rural and beautiful region. And it does produce the most milk of any state in New England. Our guest, John D.E. Roberts, is a former longtime dairyman, but he is now the recently named executive director of the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition. John, welcome to dairybusiness.com.
It's good to be here, Joel.
Give us just a little bit of background of your career in dairying, and then understand you worked with the environmental issues of the state of Vermont, and now in your new position. Just give us a few highlights.
Okay, so as many of your listeners will be able to tell, I'm not a Vermonter by birth. Originally brought up in England, brought up in a city in England. Rather strangely, by the age of 8, I told my parents I wished to be a farmer. I studied ag at university in England, but had very strong American connections. My mother was part American. My mother was actually born in Brookline, Massachusetts, but went back to England at the age of 3 months when my grandfather joined the British Army to fight in World War I. While I was at college, I thought it would be a great idea to come and work on a farm for the summer in the States and visit relatives. And by chance, I was offered a summer job on a farm in Vermont, in Champlain, Vermont. And the reason I accepted, I had 2 or 3 offers. I accepted this one because the owner told me he had a herd of brown Swiss cows, and I had never seen brown Swiss. Cut a long story short, I married the boss's daughter. We courted across the Atlantic for a couple of years, and then I wished to finish my degree. I graduated from college over there and came back and ended up managing the farm for my father-in-law for a couple of years before we decided we needed our own farm or wanted to try it on our own, which was something I never envisaged being able to do in England because its land is short and very expensive over there. Anyway, 1977, we bought a small farm just outside Middlebury, Vermont, in the town of Cornwall, and started with 32 cows, of which most of them were Holsteins, grade Holsteins, and we had about 8 registered brown Swiss. And over the next 40 years, we grew from that to a milking herd of 195, all registered brown Swiss, except for 2 Holsteins. And that's where we stayed until we sold our herd in 2012. We were at one point one of the 20 largest purebred herds of Swiss in the country. Excuse me, in the country, which sort of says something about the small quantity of Swiss. I can go on and on about how wonderful Swiss cows are. They are an amazing breed. I'm sort of shocked that they are not more widely appreciated for their milk components and the quantity. We actually sold a cow, a bred heifer in our auction, who went on to be a world champion cow. She was reserve grand champion, I believe, at Dairy Expo 2 years in a row, and made milk records of 45 to 55,000 pounds of milk, which is pretty incredible. And it's sort of wonderful to know that, yeah, she was bred on our farm, although we had nothing to do with the excellent job that the purchaser did in raising her.
Well, you provided the genetics.
We provided the genetics. So anyway, 2012, we decided that farming, we had to get out of farming. My children very wisely probably decided not to be farmers. I have 4 children. They all have very excellent jobs. Luckily for them in this COVID crisis, they've all been fully employed throughout the crisis, so that's good. But I did not wish to retire. I'm not the retiring kind. I enjoy working. And I was offered a job fairly soon after I sold the farm by the state of Vermont Agency of Ag to become one of their, well, actually I was their first water quality specialist who specialized in small farms. That in Vermont is less than 200 milking mature cows. And just, you know, we are a very small dairy state. We produce, I believe, about 1.5% of all the milk in the United States. But dairy is vital to Vermont. 85% of our milk is exported out of state. We provide the vast majority of milk to the cities of Boston, milk and dairy products. The city of Boston brings in, you know, over $600 million a year into the state. And once it works itself through the economy, that is close to $3.3 billion, employing 17,000 people throughout the dairy industry. So for the last 6.5 years, I was a water quality specialist for the Agency of Ag, which meant enforcing or bringing farmers into compliance is probably a nicer way to say it, with the Vermont's environmental rules. And Vermont had recently vastly tightened its environmental rules, partly because the western border of Vermont is bordered with Lake Champlain, which we share with New York on the west side and the province of Quebec on the north end. And but Vermont is the bigger, 65% of the Champlain watershed is Vermont. And the EPA had ruled that there was way too much phosphorus getting into Lake Champlain, and we had to do our part to reduce that amount of phosphorus. It was determined that agriculture contributed about roughly 50% of all the phosphorus going into the lake. So rules for agriculture became very important and were basically started to be enforced in 2016. These are called the Vermont RAPs, or Required Agricultural Practice Rules. And they cover things like manure pit management, production area management, buffers along streams and rivers, between the streams and the rivers, and corn or any other annual crop. We grow about 90,000 acres of corn in Vermont. And it had a lot of incentives in there. There were grants to help farmers upgrade their facilities. A lot of farmers had done things in the 1990s, for example, which, you know, later years had shown were not quite adequate enough. A lot of it through NRCS, and we needed to upgrade a lot of that. And we're still, you know, Vermont is still heavily involved in that. And, you know, we have, it's sort of interesting, when I first moved to Vermont permanently in 1974, we had nearly 5,000 dairy farmers in Vermont. Today, we have probably 630. We've actually suffered quite a sharp little drop as of from March of this year because of the COVID crisis. Farmers who've just had enough, at least of dairying. And, but we still ship almost the same amount of milk. It's just the history of dairy farming. Dairy farmers are very efficient. We have a pricing system that is ridiculous, to put it bluntly. And, you know, we need to become even more efficient, and cows can lend themselves to being growth in size quite handily. Yes, there are increased issues with environmental issues and with animal welfare issues, but you know, farmers generally handle those extremely well. It's always the very few that make the headlines, and so I did that job for 6.5 years. This job as executive director came along. It saved me 12 hours a week of commuting. So it was pretty much a no-brainer pretty quickly. Plus, the Champlain Coalition, when I was a farmer, I was one of the founding members of the coalition. So I was very used to it, very familiar with it. It started out with, I think, 12 or 14 members. I was the very first president of it. When I worked for the state, I was not actively involved, although I stayed a member. But anyway, it was bringing me back to what I really love, which is advocating for farmers. I really have a strong belief in agriculture, in Vermont agriculture. And it doesn't really matter. I became a dairy farmer because I came to Vermont. I probably, if I'd married a girl in Kansas, I'd have been a wheat farmer. I don't know. So, but I do love, I miss the cows. I don't miss the business of farming.
Tell us a little bit about the Farmer Coalition helps producers and not just dairy farmers, but according to your website, other farmers use proper practices in order to control runoff and use cover crops and the like. Talk just a little bit about what the activities of the coalition are now.
So the coalition started with 12, 14 members. We now have 150 and are constantly growing. It is mostly farmers from, you know, 1,800 cow dairy operations, which is big for Vermont, you know, down to quite small dairy operations or pig operations. We have 1-2 pig operations in Vermont. We have more and more beef, sheep, dairy goat, vegetable. All, you know, we cover the broad spectrum, both conventional and organic. We also have a fair number of ag business members who, you know, are not, they're not voting members in a way, but they are able to express their opinion and keep abreast of what the farmers are doing. The founding reasons for this organization were because of initially the bad press that we felt farmers were getting for their environmental stewardship, which we all felt was a misguided and narrow viewpoint. So we started this organization to promote both economically sustainable agriculture, but with a water quality component. And over the years, we have done, the coalition has done a number of field events demonstrating new things like no-till planting, cover cropping, injecting manure, both into corn ground and into grassland. We helped get a grant from the state to import a grassland manure injector from Holland to try out in Vermont, and it's worked very well. It needs, you know, we've learned on how our conditions are different, but it's very important. You know, Vermont grows we have about a 1.5 million, 1.5 million acres of farmland. Most of it is in grass or forage. As I said, we have about 90,000 acres of corn. One of the successes, which isn't just due to us, but is helped by, there are 2 other organizations in Vermont that also work with farmers. I mean, you know, farmer organizations. There are lots of other people, but you know, in the last 10 years, we've gone from about 5,000 acres of cover cropping to over 45,000 acres of cover cropping throughout the state. We in Addison County, where our coalition is sort of centered, but is gradually expanding out, I think we have about 17,000 acres of cover cropping now.
John?
Cover cropping really reduces a lot of phosphorus.
Excuse me, I've got to pause for just a moment.
Yep.
Well, John, in addition to those farming practices, as you assume your leadership role, what are your priorities? What are some of the projects that you've got on your agenda?
Well, of course, membership is always something we have to be aware of. So we wish to expand membership, broaden membership, you know, across the board. We may have many fewer dairy farmers, but we have a very thriving and growing active group of younger farmers who are not involved in dairying, who are growing vegetables or numerous other things, or processing products. I wish to reach out to them, make sure that we have a good, younger, broad representation of, across the board, diverse, both in every possible way. We're very, very open to that. Funding is a big thing. We have to fund this organization. We presently have a grant that funds us and pays my salary, for example. That grant, runs out at a certain point, so I need to work on that. Despite the fact that we are a small, very agricultural state, we have a legislature which has almost no farmer representation in it. So we have to spend an awful lot of time educating legislators and the community. I'm trying to develop bridges with environmental groups, some of which have, very black and white vision of what the good environment is or what farm practices are, and we need to work to develop a broader understanding of what agriculture really is about. I do think we're possibly helped by this COVID crisis, because if nothing else, our consumers, who are very, very vital, have been alerted to food security, food supply chain importance, and all of that. I think we can build on that. So that's, and we just need to make sure that our members are aware of what areas on their farm that they can improve. I mean, there is no perfect farm. And of course, typical farming, once you think you've got things perfect, Mother Nature comes along and shows you how you are not. Or, you haven't thought of that 100-year flood or 100-year drought, whichever it is. It's hard to plan for those things. So we're in a fairly dry situation this year right now, which has been a benefit to many farmers in some ways, because the last 2 years were incredibly wet, and But, you know, typical farmer, you worry about what it's going to be like in September when the corn needs to be chopped.
Sure.
So I think that's some of the things that we need to very quickly work on. I mean, there are long-term goals. You know, we need to keep our consumers appraised of the good job that dairy farmers are doing. Farmers in general, sorry, not just dairy farmers, speaking like an old dairy farmer. You know, we need to keep them appraised that, you know, when you smell manure, that's a sign of good nutrients being recycled. It is not a waste product. It is not something you should be ashamed of. Conversely, maybe we can work on the farmers there are different ways, different times you could spread that manure that maybe it isn't such a thumb in the eye of your neighbor or something like that, you know.
Sure.
You know, we like to think of ourselves as our own masters of our property and environment, but unfortunately we really don't control everything, and you know, we certainly don't control the wind and the rain.
Well, we wish you great success in caring for the farmers and the environment in the beautiful state of Vermont. We've been talking with John D.E. Roberts, who's the executive director of the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, located in Middlebury, Vermont. And I'm your host, Joel Hastings, for dairybusiness.com.